Hello, welcome to the next episode of Joseph's Fireside Chat series. Today's a very special episode. I'm being joined by Dr. Megan Ma, who is co-founder and executive director of liftlab. Is that right? Am I pronouncing it right? There you go. Which is the legal innovation through frontier technology lab at Stanford Law School. Um, it's a funny one because me and Megan have never met. I've never done a fireside chat series like this. I heard you speak 2 years ago, I think, Megan, at Codex. Um, I've probably heard you speak a few different times, but there was one thing that you said that really stuck out to me around comparing legal AI tools or systems to self-driving cars when we're thinking about risk and safety. And not only has that stuck with me, it's really driven a lot of our product development here at Joseph, because it really resonated with me and the team. So I reached out to you as a fan. Um, and you very generously agreed to sit down with me today. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me, and it's great to be here. And I'm glad that resonated. In part, it comes from a little bit about my background, where I had worked briefly for the Canadian government on self-driving cars, and so I felt like a lot of what I had learned in that time feels very transferable to today. Um, I mean, this is also lessons that are shared from actually Guardrails AI and the co-founder and CEO, Shreya Rajpal. She
Mhm.
actually was building self-driving cars, and so much of her knowledge around risk mitigation and AI safety also comes from her experience in self-driving cars. And so I think there's definitely quite a bit of overlap. A lot of what was viewed as unsolved problems, or how do you actually even define risk, and particularly for something that is fairly high stakes, such as, can you ask actually an agent as the size of a vehicle to make determinations of, what are safe actions, or like what are, behaviors that maybe are reflective of humans. But on the other hand, even humans don't have the same foresight that they should when they, do things like driving. And so what we kind of think about a lot is, how do we actually um, gently signal almost to humans um, where we need to intervene. And I think, like, particularly tools as powerful as large language models, it's actually overwhelming to say we need humans in the loop. Where actually you plug in a human in like a given workflow, we don't even have that well defined in the legal space. And so when you say, like, oh, we're drafting a contract, there's actually like 15 substeps, and no one talks about those substeps. And instead, we're just sort of like, okay, we can leave all of that to a model. And that's really where things, slip up, right? And when
Mhm.
people feel like the models are either underperforming, or, they're running into issues where, they're not retrieving information properly, or the language is a little bit strange or not up to your preferences. I think what we're kind of now working towards is, as opposed to just, creating these shallow lines between what is human labor and what is machine labor, we're starting to move into a space where, how do you continuously and iteratively engage with our tools? So many of these tools are actually much better at prompting the humans and figuring out what their own preferences are and what they really want to say, than us being able to prompt the tools. And I think that that's kind of a new paradigm shift that we're working towards now.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the one of the things that you said a couple of years ago was people were moving towards building self-driving cars that were perfect, that would never have an accident. And then when they realized that was unachievable, they started looking at, well, how do you build the best alarm system? How do you build the best escalation pathway? And Joseph was like first in this space. In like a month after ChatGPT launched, we were building Q&A tools with legal and compliance teams. And we hit that very early. Everyone was saying, but is it 100%? And I was like, oh
Mhm.
no, how do I even deal with this? Now we know how to deal with this. We've got lots of benchmarking. Expectation setting is much easier because the market understands the technology. But at that time, that paradigm shift, I think, was really foundational for me. What do you still think that parallel works today? Has that changed for you?
I definitely think the parallel exists, and very much is flourishing. And particularly, like, I think the point that I had made back then was about intelligent alarms that kind of
Mhm. Yeah.
were brought in. And it was honestly, to me, a stroke of genius from some of these engineers, because they were like, well, there's no way for you to necessarily be able to understand the entire universe of what risks are available. And there's a ton of unknown unknowns as well that you just
Mhm.
don't have the tools to be able to measure even. And so what you should be focusing on is, how do you actually, again, engage in human machine collaboration? And that is how can the machine tell you, hey, I need a little bit of help here?
Yes.
And not to anthropomorphize like our tools, but basically the whole idea was, let's start thinking about things like sonar signaling, like what kind of sounds actually scare humans as opposed to get their attention. And that could make a monumental difference for something like self-driving cars, because if you're shocked when there's a pending accident in front of you, then you're further paralyzed, and actually just further delays your reaction and makes things worse. And so that kind of pivot was really, to me, fundamental in how they were able to even consider deployment. In, at least in the Bay Area and in SF right now, I've been in a couple and they are great. I personally love them. Um, but how that sort of applies for like large language models, everyone had this obsession around, what are sort of the universe of like reasons why we should not be using these tools. And all of them hovered around this hallucination space. But
Mhm.
I'm sure like the experience that you had with Joseph was that hallucination is not only kind of going to be a sunk cost, so to speak, with these tools that you're building, but also it's fundamental to how the technology works. And
Mhm.
so once you sort of realize that, then what you care about are risks of actually user engagement. And so, how do you actually kind of understand and interpret what humans want or humans need, kind of when things don't go the way that they want to? And what I mean by that is, like, you mentioned expectation setting. Sometimes it's also questions like helpfulness, right? Like when humans are like, this is not good for me, is it that it's not necessarily communicating things in the way that you want the information to be received? Or is it that like it's saying things that are just totally off the rails and actually like putting you in kind of a bad place? And so
Mhm.
it's like entirely deviating from what you need in that moment versus just like a micro kind of preference consideration. So these are sort of to me, like the deeper questions that we should be working towards, as opposed to just like, is it accurate or not?
Mm. It's really interesting. I feel like, and this is just my interpretation, I feel like your focus may have shifted a little from the intelligence of the alarm system. So identifying when to let the person know that they need to take over, to, tell me if this is right, more to like the user experience, the UX, the UI, like teaching the person interacting with the tool how to successfully interact with it. Is that right?
Yeah, actually, that's spot on. So I think what I realized over time is, for I think at least many of the legal professionals that I've spoken to, they have never been asked the question of, what do you want?
Mm.
When it comes to your work tools. They've actually just been passive receivers of technology. And that, contributes to problems of things like change management, right? I can't get out of the paradigm of Microsoft Office 365 because I had spent all this time and energy trying to make, these nuances of formatting or whatever other kind of idiosyncrasies of the tool make sense for me. Once I
Uh-huh.
invest that time, I don't want to kind of move to anything else, because it's the sunk cost fallacy at this point. And so when you actually now have a tool that is so fundamentally flexible, adaptable, and capable of actually curating to your preference, that's really where so many of these hard questions all of a sudden pop up, and
Hmm.
lawyers, don't really know how to respond to them necessarily. Just as one example, like a law firm that we worked with, they were dead set that we needed a Microsoft Word plugin for the tool that we were trying to co-create together to make sense. Once we did that and the team had spent tireless nights on it, when they actually saw the execution, they were like, well, this is a little messy. I'm not really sure I totally understand what's happening. We didn't change a single thing on the back end, and we moved it onto a browser-based sort of platform. We only showcased that one functionality. It was a clean design. And the result was, well, this is actually fundamentally what we need. And then they started saying that, like, these are the types of tools that they want to advance towards. And that to me was a huge signal that you're so stuck in a particular paradigm, particularly because the legal tech space has been dominated by incumbents for so long. Now we have all these burgeoning and fruitful and exciting new tools. How do you kind of distinguish all of them? And, many of these law firms are facing things like vendor fatigue and whatnot. But kind of at the very end of the day, when you allow them to test and experiment with what you've built, you suddenly realize that user engagement is something that is a huge gap that
Hmm.
we're only starting to like even touch the surface of what we can offer to the legal community today. And particularly, Joseph, you work in the Joseph works in the access to justice space. And I think that is also a totally different question, right? Because for the average consumer, they've been flooded with, endless kinds of possibilities. How do you kind of streamline for what they really expect? So I
Hmm.
think UI UX is kind of an underrated and one of the hardest questions.
Agree. Um, the chief innovation officer at a law firm here in the States said to me recently, the capacities for disappointment with AI are endless. Or infinite, actually, he said,
Yeah.
which landed more strongly, and I think that's absolutely right. Um, yeah, that's very interesting. Um, I think one of the things, like to that point, one of the critical components of getting Joseph's tools ready for launch, right? Whether in an access to justice space or in a corporate legal department at a Fortune 500 company. And I actually think there's more parallels than most people think between those two. But getting the tools ready for launch, yes, of course, so much of it was about benchmarking and reliability and accuracy. And we test all those things and can give you like a percentage. But it was so much more about giving the lawyer or the compliance officer the feeling of control so
Mm.
that they knew they could step in, they could see it all, it was transparent. And that was ultimately a UX and a UI problem. Like there wasn't so much that was like technologically sophisticated about that. Yeah, anyway, we could talk about that for hours, I suspect. But I want to move on because you're doing research in so many spaces. One of the ones that I was reading about was the idea of legal personas, which I found really interesting. Tell us a little bit more about that. Tell us about legal personas and how they interact with LLMs.
Yeah, so this basically falls in line with, I guess, a deeper passion of mine at the moment, which is thinking about legal education and professional development of lawyers. I think you've rightly fully pointed that I moved from sort of this um, focus around the technology and how the technology makes sense for the profession to how does the profession make sense of the technology? So the inverse, right? And a
Mhm.
lot of it is not only just training lawyers on, how to use these tools, but also how do you leverage these tools to create experiences to help lawyers hone in on their legal skills. So many of the tools that are on the market right now, they're kind of onboarded very quickly into a law firm. And we're excited about the enthusiasm that the legal industry has come with new AI tools. But I think a lot of it is that you train historically on grunt work and volumes of it. When you take away volumes of grunt work, you don't really have any other tools that are readily available to train your young associates. And for law school, at least in the US, you don't even have an apprenticeship period, right? You kind of are baptism by fire, training by fire, and you just get thrown in. And
I
so a
remember.
lot of why we focused on legal personas is the idea of you learn actually from anecdotal experience and you accumulate all these really interesting experiences, and that sort of affects in some way your judgment as an experienced lawyer. If we could somehow download the brains of these senior lawyers and allow our young associates to kind of walk a mile in their shoe, that's kind of to us the future of legal training. It's going to impact strategy development and all of these kinds of skills that you start getting once you hit a milestone of maybe 1,000 contracts that you've reviewed. But if you don't have 1,000 contracts anymore, or you have clients on the other hand saying, please don't have your associates train on my work or my matter, you don't have anything left. And so where we started to develop this concept of personas actually came from some of the tools that we were building. We were building an M&A negotiation simulator, which allowed a young associate to first go through client intake, engage with the persona of various clients that a firm might have, and then you move on to opposing counsel, picking up some of that nuance that that opposing counsel might say to kind of display their leverage in the particular deal. You might at some point need to call on specialty counsel, like a tax specialist, an employment lawyer, if that particular deal has issues related to, what's the future corporate structure post-acquisition. Or, you might have on the horizon, maybe some litigation associated with, wrongful termination of an employee in the seller. And so you might want to look into some of that and speak with consult with your employment counsel. And so these are things that exist in practice and you've learned over the years and being taught by partners that you were mentored under, but you might not get that experience as quickly. And so we give previews through simulation. In other tools, we actually allow kind of real-time feedback almost from a downloaded brain of a partner, so to speak, and becomes an AI twin of that partner. So say you upload a document that you're going through red lines for, and then I can select Sam. And then your AI basically overlays your red lines and explanations of those red lines. And so that when I am outside of that 2 or 3 a.m. deadline, me trying to get that document over the finish line, rather than just clicking accept, 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 I have the time to go over and view in your eyes why those red lines existed. And then later on, I might find 5 minutes, 10 minutes of your time as the human Sam and say, hey, look, I've run this through the tool. I noticed XYZ things in where I didn't redline and where you did instead, and you provided explanations. Could we actually go a little further on this? And so you're not only creating a hierarchy of operations, you're also allowing kind of the young associate to start thinking critically from your perspective and your experience. And so those are some things that we've been working on when it comes to personas. And it really came down to what was one fundamental strength of large language models. And to us, that was role playing. And so, when you experiment with things like, oh, can you explain this to me like a pirate? It does it pretty well. And so we're like, can you explain this to me like this senior partner in this particular area? And so that's kind of where all of this kind of comes to head.
Extraordinary. Like one of the arguments that I've never found compelling against large language models is this idea that junior associates won't be able to learn how to be a lawyer, right? I think that's kind of BS because I was a junior attorney for many years. And by the time I reviewed my 10,000th document in one litigation, I wasn't learning anything anymore. Like there were other economic interests at play. I think that's fascinating. And I also think what it does is it also respects the partner's time more because I'm the partner in this situation, pity the associate, but I'm not going through and running them through like every single edit. They're just coming to me and saying, hey, this one didn't make sense. So we're operating at that higher level.
Exactly.
Right.
And I think to me, it was almost like that office hours paradigm. I
Yes.
wish I could get to 20, even 10 students during my office hours. But instead, I can maybe get to 2 or 3 because a lot of people have difficulty articulating what they don't know. And sometimes there's a fear actually of, I don't want to say explicitly what I don't know. And so kind of allowing them to have a safe space to almost triage that, that's kind of what our hope is building confidence earlier in your career and kind of ramping up so that you get to senior levels of expertise like at a much faster rate.
Amazing. What let's go broader. What's the coolest thing you've seen in the legal AI space recently?
Maybe not the legal AI space, but
Broader, yeah.
I've been really, really interested in this question of simulation testing and just in general using simulations. There's been a couple of startups that have been very focused on using simulation as a strategy or a form of business strategy, where you can create multi-agents of a particular kind of corporation, and you can build workflows or mirror workflows that exist in that particular company. And then if you play them out a couple of rounds or play them out in different ways, can you actually game out how you can kind of determine which path makes the most sense given a set of circumstances. So we've seen that sort of more broadly. We actually started cracking that internally here, where we're building agent law firm, which is trying to understand for an in-house counsel, why would I choose firm A over firm B for a particular ask? If I put out an RFP, like it's beyond just, my strong relationship with you, Sam. I want to actually kind of determine why I would go with your firm with an additional data point. So these are some things that I've been super fascinated about. The other thing that simulation has been doing, kind of going back to the early days of self-driving cars, is it's been used to also like figure out what might be the universe of risks, which risks are perceived and overblown, and which risks are actually actual risks and things that I should focus on. And so we're starting to see, some really exciting work in kind of how do you use simulation again for risk mitigation purposes. And this is something that, actually draws from self-driving cars as well.
Cool. Something historically lawyers are not great at, assessing the likelihood of a risk, right? Cool. How far do you think this is going to go, and how fast, looking ahead to the future?
In terms of this particular area of technology, or just generally for legal AI?
Legal AI. What are you seeing? Where do you think it's going to go?
It's a sort of gentle or sometimes humbling balance between getting very, very excited on the one hand about all the sort of rapid pace of technological development. I think being situated at Josef as well, you're probably well aware, like you're kind of drinking by the fire hose all the time, trying to figure out how to reconcile this technology into the legal space. On the other hand, most of the questions are actually just fundamentally structural hurdles, I'd say, or persistent structural obstacles that you face from an industry that really hasn't had a lot of resistance to change, basically. Sort of has strong resistance to change.
I was going to say, are you working in a different industry?
And so, you're kind of like a train going at full speed against stop signs constantly. And I think it's a weird juxtaposition to live in. And so when you think, how far is this all going to go? It's always going to go as far as whatever is the next stop sign, so to speak. And, whether that is the persistent billable hour, which people have been describing the death for 30 years, or it's, something about thinking about how do you actually do training, right? Training is going to be a coming pain point, which is what we've been trying to tackle for so long. And so I think it's entirely hard to say like how far we will go. I think we will have a realization at some point that it's not just about technological adoption, it's about sustainable adoption. And I think the sustainability will naturally come from having genuine metrics in the legal space. How do you define quality in legal work? When I say this is a good contract, you can't just take my word for it. You can actually verify it. And this will be important for when you take a look at how you want to plug in models to do different types of contractual work. that's the kind of sort of questions that we are going to be exploring in, I think, the next little while. And until we make that breakthrough, I don't know where the horizon is.
If you had 5 minutes with the general counsel of a Fortune 500 company, what would you be telling them to think about right now? Obviously, you're working a lot on the law firm side. What would you be thinking about on the in-house side?
I think on the in-house side, they have pretty much they have a new role, right? That rather than being almost the bottleneck in the company, that all compliance and, you're the person that's like considered, oh, I have to do all the risk hedging. And so you have a lot of this, not necessarily fear, but responsibility to make the conscious or like conscientious choice here. You're actually now reframed as the person that's driving strategy. And that kind of looks very different. And all of that comes from onboarding technology or onboarding generative AI in a clever way. We're seeing some startups kind of working directly in the space where their population or their target user is the GC, because they want, or GC or CLO, because they want them to finally feel like their seat at the table
Mm,
is kind of bringing towards the positive light of like, I'm here for business strategy, as opposed to I'm here to kind of slow you down. And that comes naturally from things like being able to have more data points so that I can tell when this contract comes to my desk or when I'm putting out an RFP in the interest, again, of my firm or my company, that I made decisions that were empirically driven or data driven. And this wasn't the case before. Like some companies, like they've had a scoring metric for, what's a safe contract and what's, like the safe harbor of like what, you it's fine to like have. And I think like these metrics didn't really exist before and now they can. And so they can leverage all of these different kinds of data points to share and communicate like, okay, if it's going to come to my desk and it's going to like, and I have to make an assessment of whether or not this particular deal and how we're executing this deal is to the company's best interest, I can now more confidently say that, as opposed to taking like the most conservative position,
hmm
and kind of feeling like you have to review over every single detail. And so if I were to have kind of those 5 minutes, I would say like, this is the moment to embrace a new role almost, and a
Yep.
new hat of kind of being the one who consciously can say to your company, this is the right approach because of XYZ reasons, and you are going to be protected because of these other reasons. Or you have just like very clear, almost like tools such as simulation or any other, available metric on your hand. All of these things are now at your fingertips.
Mm, great. I love that. It's almost like giving them enough information so they can take more calculated risks, right? Which
Exactly.
is kind of part of their job.
Mhm.
That's fascinating. I think one of the patterns that we're seeing here at Joseph, because we work with a lot of GCs and in-house teams, is we're taking that lower level work off their plates. So repetitive questions, repetitive documents, etc. But in doing so, there are a lot of second and third order value, right? Not only are they no longer doing that work, they're getting access to the data to tell stories about what's happening in the business,
Mhm.
or even to do horizon scanning, or to say these parts of our knowledge base are missing. So they're leveling up the work that they're doing in a really exciting way.
Exactly.
I've taken up so much of your time, Megan. One final question before we wrap up. Um, what's one question or topic we should be thinking about in AI that we're not?
I think I alluded to this and we talked, a little bit at length about this, but it's to me the UI UX question,
Mhm.
which is we are not asking lawyers in the right way what they actually want from their tools and want from various ways and even how they engage with one another. Because it's not just about the ecosystem of like one on one of like me and how I engage with like any X number of platforms. It's how the platforms are transforming broadly collaboration even within my team. And historically, kind of the workflow for a lawyer was very hierarchical, and it was also kind of like a Ford assembly line, right? Juniors pass things to seniors and then to partners and back down. Now we're kind of creating opportunities for shared knowledge spaces where you can have information permeate more fluidly. And I think that this is basically requires almost a reframing even of how we want to be using our tools. And it's not just, antiquated library systems where I check out a template and no one else can check it out until someone puts it back there. And like all of these things basically hinder us from working with one another. And everyone knows that, lawyers actually work in teams, but we are kind of projecting in a different image. And I think that we're now starting to think about tools that can actually showcase why certain legal teams work much better than others. And so to me, it's again, UX and questions of collaboration.
Cool. I think that's a perfect note to end on, and something that I spend most days thinking about. So I love that. Megan, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure all of our listeners do as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam.